Mr. President,
Majority Leader,
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
without objection.
Now, Mr. President, it is difficult to put into words what it is like to stand here on the floor of the United States Senate on this day of all days. For 163 years, this space has been the home of the upper chamber of the American Congress. What has taken place inside this room over the centuries has determined in very real ways the trajectory of our nation. In this room, we carry on the mission handed down to us by the framers to assure the voice of the people is heard and represented and acted upon. But 1 year ago today, on January 6, 2021, mob violence descended upon this chamber and upon this Capitol. Thousands of rioters, possessed by equal measures of rage, conspiracy, and spurred into action by the sitting President of the United States, attacked the United States Capitol in an armed, violent, and deadly effort to halt the peaceful transfer of power. Its windows were smashed, its offices were vandalized, and lawmakers and our staffs, everyday citizens who love their country and work here every day, feared for their lives. Nearly 140 police officers were injured, and at least 5 people lost their lives that day or in its aftermath. The warnings of history are clear. When democracies are in danger, it often starts with a mob. That's what happened a year ago here in this building, a mob attack. And for mob violence to win the day, it doesn't need everyone to join in. It just needs a critical mass of people to stay out of the way, to ignore it, to underestimate it, to excuse it, and even condone it. The mob can start out as a small number, but if it's allowed to grow and leaders egg on the mob, encourage it, it can become poison. That is what Donald Trump is doing, as even his response to President Biden's speech today showed. And once that happens, the unthinkable could become real. Democracy erodes and could, God forbid, horror of horrors, vanish. The poisonous mob mentality lives on today in the threats against election workers, poll workers, even other public servants like school board members and health workers. This is what erodes a democracy. And Donald Trump today continues to spread his poisonous vial about the big lie. To borrow from President Franklin Roosevelt, the violent insurrection of January 6 was a day that will live forever in infamy, a permanent stain in the story of the American democracy, and the final, bitter, unforgivable act of the worst president in modern times. Today, on this first anniversary, members from both the House and Senate and our staffs, the President and the Vice President, are here today at the Capitol, and one of our purposes is to share memories in commemoration of that day. At noon, we will hold a moment of silence in honor of those who were lost because of the attack. And to all my colleagues and to staff who struggle to get through today, you're not alone. You are not alone. We are here by your side. The Employee Assistance Program has resources available to all Senate staff who are processing what happened a year ago. Let me share my personal experience on that day. As I've recounted many times since then, my personal experience that day was in some ways like the opening sentence of Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, the best of times, the worst of times. First came the best of times. 12 hours before the attack, at 4 a.m. in the morning, I learned, or several hours before the attack, at 4 a.m., I learned that our 2 Democratic senators had won in Georgia, and we would gain the majority. At 4 a.m., it became clear. I tried to get some sleep, couldn't, got down in my car, drove to Washington, and got to the floor of this chamber at 1 p.m. for the first time as the putative majority leader. Within 45 minutes of sitting there and watching the beginning of counting the ballots, a police officer in a big flak jacket and a large rifle grabbed me firmly by the collar, like this. I'll never forget that grip. And said to me, "Senator, we got to get out of here. You're in danger." We walked out the Senate chamber door, made a right turn, went through another door. This happened to be captured on the video tape above, and it was shown at the impeachment trial, although I didn't even know they had the tape until I saw it at the impeachment trial. But we go through the door, you don't see us for 20 seconds, and then we are running out of the door at full speed. I was within 30 feet of these nasty, racist, bigoted insurrectionists. Had someone had a gun, had two of them blocked off the door, who knows what would have happened. I was told later that one of them reportedly said, "There's the big Jew, let's get him." Bigotry against one is bigotry against all. And I saw something that I've been told later never happened before, the Confederate flag flying in this dear capital. That's just one of many searing, grotesque images of that unimaginable, most un-American day. There were good moments too. I remember when the leaders, Senator McConnell, myself, Speaker Pelosi, Leader McCarthy, were sent off to the secret place. We convened after desperately trying to get the president on the phone to ask him to call the rioters off. We spoke to the Secretary of Defense and the acting Attorney General, but to no avail. But then the four of us got together and said, we're going to come back. We're going to count those votes. We're not going to let the violent insurrectionists stop us, and count the votes we did until I believe it was 3 a.m. the next morning. That was a good moment amidst a lot of bad moments. So now we ask, 1 year later, how shall our country move forward? What are we to say and think and do in response to a day when a sitting American president, rather than step down from office, unleashed his own supporters to attack the government through mob violence? How can we help those scarred by that day find solace, find healing? How can we make clear to the American people, to the world, and even to ourselves, that our democracy is still whole? First, we must begin by commemorating our emergency responders who have died, whether through complications from injuries or sadly through suicide, in the days and months after the violence. Brian Sicknick of New Jersey, Howie Liebengood of Virginia, Billy Evans of Massachusetts, Jeffrey Smith of Illinois, and Gunther Hashida of Virginia. Today and every day, we remember them. We mourn their loss. We honor their limitless heroism in the face of the unthinkable. Second, we also thank every single member of the Capitol Police, the DC Metro Police, and the National Guard, who kept us safe and prevented a violent riot from turning into something much worse. That afternoon, our Capitol Police were outnumbered, unprepared, and largely left on their own. Just watching on television the brutal beating of one of them by the mob, another being crushed between a door and a wall, just rips your heart apart, and you relive that day, and you remember how the Capitol Police suffered but persisted and helped preserve our democracy. When they held the line, our democracy survived, and so not only do we thank them, but we commit to continue supporting them and fighting for them as they fought to defend this building. Finally, The only way we'll truly move forward from January 6th is by speaking truth to power. We cannot avoid it. The truth about what happened that day, about what led to the violence, about what it means for our democracy moving forward. I say this because too many, often depending on their allegiances, seem desperate to sweep the memory of January 6th under the rug. Too many are working to rewrite the history of what happened, to downplay or excuse or even defend the mob, to excuse an insurrection of this very Capitol. Too many are hoping the American people will just look away and forget that that day ever took place. After all, they say, Donald Trump is no longer president, right? That can't happen. We can't let that happen. We have an obligation not to let that happen. Because history shows us when you ignore or paint over this kind of violent action, it will recur, often in worse form than it had originally. That's what history shows. We didn't look away after the attack on Pearl Harbor. We didn't look away after the attacks on 9/11. They may have been from foreign powers, but we still, just because it was Americans who did this, we cannot look away after the attack of January 6th. What we must do instead is stare the truth, however ugly, in the face. The attack of January 6th didn't come out of the blue. It was not an act of God. It was not something that came from foreign soil. It wasn't even just some mere protest that got out of hand. No, 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 no. January 6th was an attempt to reverse, through violent means, the outcome of a free and fair election. An insurrection. Call it what it is, what it was. And it was fundamentally rooted in Donald Trump's big lie that the election of 2020 was illegitimate, in deep offense to the peaceful transfer of power. Indeed, in deep offense to the very notion of truth itself. And anyone who thinks that the origins of this insurrection are going away should just have listened a few moments ago when Donald Trump did it again, lying and lying and lying about the election. A clear reminder that the threat he and his lie remain to our nation. Alarmingly, many of his supporters quickly embraced the lie in the aftermath of the 2020 election. Many of them truly believed and still believe that he won the election and the game was rigged. Not a small number, large numbers of Americans. If you look at the polls, tens of millions. It didn't matter there was no proof to any of these claims. Donald Trump kept saying it and saying it and saying it again. And he called his supporters to rally here in Washington in a ditch effort to stay in power. We all know this. That's what happened. We can't forget it. It was Donald Trump's big lie that soaked our political landscape in kerosene. It was Donald Trump's rally on the Mall that struck the match. And then came the fire. And pouring gasoline on that fire are many in one branch of our media who spread the big lie then and continue to spread the big lie, even though they know it's false. And millions listen to these people and believe it. Here, too, is another terrible truth. The disease of the big lie continues to this day. The attacks on our democracy are ongoing. If not by the force of baseball bats and pipe bombs, then certainly through a quieter and much more organized effort to subvert democracy from the bottom up. Just as the big lie inspired the attack of January 6th, the big lie continues like a disease across state legislatures throughout the country, where we're seeing the most restrictive voter suppression efforts since Jim Crow in 21st century America, turning the clock way back. Let's be abundantly clear. These new anti-voter laws are on the books today only because their authors cited the big lie, cited the fictitious bugaboo of voter fraud, and are trying to succeed where the insurrection failed. Unless we confront the big lie, unless we all do our part to fortify and strengthen our democracy, the political violence of January 6th risks becoming not an aberration, but, God forbid, the norm. And we've seen it too in the threats against election workers, teachers, school administrators, healthcare workers. We cannot put our heads in the sand. We cannot brush this over. And what does that mean for the Senate? I think we have to talk about the realities here today too. It means we must pass legislation, effective legislation, to defend our democracy, to protect the right to vote. We must pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act so that our country's destiny is determined by the voice of the people and not by the violent whims of lies and even mob rule. We must also guard against the false hopes of solutions that don't deal with the problem, that try to cover it up or push it away because people don't want to deal with it. Some say the answer lies in doing the bare minimum, like reforming the Electoral Count Act that my friend, the Republican leader, has floated in recent days. Let me take this opportunity to make clear that that plan, the McConnell plan, that's what it is unacceptable, unacceptably insufficient, and even offensive. Some scorekeeping matters little if the game is rigged. And as we know too well, state legislatures are working day and night to undermine our democratic process from the get-go by empowering partisans to potentially say which ballots count and which do not. What good is it to accurately count a result that's compromised from the start? Senator McConnell's plan to reform the Electoral Count Act would do nothing more than codify the Vice President's ceremonial role in counting of the Electoral College votes, effectively guaranteeing that partisan state legislatures could overturn the elections without fear of recourse. Look at what it does. Look at what it does. It's a cynical idea. It's an idea to divert attention from the real issue because they don't want to confront the real issue. This cannot be, this should not be about one party versus another. Voting rights has always been bipartisan, supported by Bush, HW and W, supported by Reagan, passing this chamber with large votes from both sides of the aisle. That's what always used to happen until the Republican Party was taken over by Donald Trump. So, it's not about one party versus another. It can't be. It's about one terrible lie against democracy itself, the kind of lie that, if let stand, both verbally and in action, erodes our democracy, erodes our democracy. If a majority of people, there's already a substantial minority who don't believe our elections are legitimate, aided and egged on by Donald Trump and the right-wing media. What if a majority of this country, because of these pernicious actions, start believing it? A majority of Americans don't believe that elections are on the level? Just ask yourself, what will happen? I can't predict the details, but I can predict that it will diminish the greatness of this country in small and even large ways. So we cannot, this should not be a partisan issue. It's about falsehood versus truth. In the history of this country, we have always disagreed on ideology, but never on facts, until recently, and in such an important area. If lying about results of an election is acceptable, if instigating a mob against the government is considered permissible, if encouraging political violence becomes the norm, it will be open season on this grand democracy, this noble experiment, and everything will be up for grabs by whoever has the biggest clubs, the sharpest spears, the most effective lies. I do not believe that that is the ultimate destiny of our country. The mob may be strong, but the counter is stronger. The roots of democracy, the feelings of the American people, and the affection and love for this grand, noble experiment in democracy is stronger as long as we speak out, as long as we act. The wellspring of democracy is deep, and even in the most difficult of times, Americans have rallied and risen to the occasion. Since the early days of our republic, Americans launched mighty movements, fought a bloody civil war, and yes, passed federal election laws and voting rights laws to expand the promise of democracy until there were no more boundaries. We are called on, importuned by the millions who have lost their lives to defend this democracy, to defend it once again. I call on all Americans, Democrats, Republicans, independents, to rise to the occasion and assure that the mob, the violence, the lies do not win the day. Let the anniversary of January 6th forever serve as a reminder that the march to perfect our democracy is never over, that our democracy is a precious, sometimes fragile gift purchased by those who struggled before us, and that all of us now must do our part to keep the American vision going in the present and into the future. Somehow, in ways I can't predict, but I know are true, I am certain that God's mysterious hand will guide us, and truth and right will prevail. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Schumer, for your leadership and your work and your words today. As I stand here, I look at the faces of the staff. I remember the moment when we were pushed out of this chamber for security reasons. I remember the word of one staff member, Lee, who yelled out, "Take the boxes, take the boxes." She was talking about the mahogany boxes that were filled with the electoral ballots because we knew they would be destroyed if they were left behind. I remember my own staff, one of them is here today, hearing their stories of being in a closet, hiding in a closet with only forks that happened to be next door to protect themselves, right next to the doors where the insurrectionists had invaded. I remember the staff throughout this building that were marooned in places, and the faces of the police officers, the cuts on their faces, the anguish in the words of Officer Dunn, who said at the end of the day that he had been called the N-word multiple times and that he had looked to his friend as they collapsed in the rotunda and said, "Is this America? Is this America?" The haunting words of the police officer on the police radio that was heard broadcast in the middle of the whole thing, "Is there a plan? Is there a plan?" There were many breakdowns that day, but the biggest breakdown was the breakdown of our democracy, that some people actually felt that they could take the law into their own hands, that they could invade not just a building, but our very republic. I look back at the words and the speeches that people gave that day, not only after the insurrection, but what was telling was what they said before it started. And I think I would urge people to look at those speeches. That discussion that we were having about this had been raging for weeks and for months. I remember standing at this very place right before we closed down the Senate because of the insurrection and going through the facts about how President-elect Biden at the time had won more votes than any president in history, the facts that 10 living defense secretaries had actually stood up at the time, including both of Donald Trump's defense secretaries, including people like Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld and William Cohen, and came together and said that the scurrilous attacks on our democracy must stop and we must allow for the peaceful transition of power. And then I looked at the very end of my remarks, and I ended with this, right before we were invaded. I said this: my friend Roy Blunt, who I still have immense respect for what he did that evening, my friend Roy Blunt, my fellow Rules Committee leader, many years ago found a statue, a bust of a man at the top of a bookcase. He did research, he went to the historians, and all he could find out was that no one knew who this guy was, except that he was a cleric. Hence, the statue is called the Unknown Cleric. Now, at the time, the leaders in this great place thought this man important enough that they would warrant a statue for him. But today, no one knows who he is. Senator Blunt's message to school kids and senators alike that visit his office when he shows them the statue: what we do here is more important than who we are. And I ended with this: senators, what matters is not our futures, not our short-term destinies. What matters is our democracy's destiny. Because I think many of us know that people will not know who we are 100 years from now or 200 years from now. But what they will know is this: they will know what we did today, how we voted today, and that is more important than who we are. As someone once said, it's a republic if we can keep it. It's a republic if we can keep it. Those words ring more true now than they did a year ago. Because as we know, the haunting shrieks of the police that day, the officer pinned between the doors at the hand of rioters, there were people that stood up for our republic, and there were people that attacked our republic. I remember Captain Carnicia Mendoza, a 19-year veteran of the Capitol Police who testified before the Rules Committee, who suffered chemical burns to her face while commanding the officers in the rotunda while they struggled to hold the doors open. Or who can forget Officer Eugene Goodman, who after saving Senator Romney from walking directly into the mob, ran by himself to take on a group of rioters with his baton and then diverted that mob away from the Senate chamber, allowing us to safely depart. Mr. President, who can forget the image right there where you sit on that dais of the insurrectionists rifling through papers on people's desks, opening up their offices and desks. Tragically, 5 officers who reported for duty have since passed away. 5 officers. You wonder why you see sad faces today on many people in this building who were their friends. Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick, who died the day after the attack. 4 other officers died in the days and months that followed. Capitol Police Officer Howard Liebengood, DC Metropolitan Police Officers Jeffrey Smith, Gunther Hashida, and Kyle DeFreitag. Many more suffered physical injuries, and even more sustained emotional trauma from the events of that day. And we also remember, of course, Officer Billy Evans, who tragically died doing his job at his post in April. Recognizing the sacrifice of those heroes to defend our democracy is the least we can do. Senator Blunt and I led legislation with the support of our leaders, honoring those who protected the Capitol on January 6th with the Congressional Gold Medal. It was an honor to stand with officers and their families in August as President Biden signed this bill into law. We have made many, many improvements to the security of the Capitol. I think it's very important for staff and officers alike and those who work there to know that. I want to thank Senator Schumer for his work in installing a new Sergeant-at-Arms, Karen Gibson for the Senate. We have General Walker over in the House, and we have a new police chief, Chief Manger, who did an excellent job yesterday in describing the changes. We know there are many challenges ahead. Last but not least is that we do not have enough police officers right now to fill vacancies. So people are working double shifts, they're working vacations, they're canceling vacations. We have over 400 openings, an experience that many police departments throughout the country have right now. but one that is very important, and the chief has committed to fill those vacancies. But what have we done? The progress? Well, we have, one, gotten the new personnel in. Two, we have passed a law in this chamber and signed into law by President Biden that makes it easier for the chief to call in the National Guard in a case of emergency. We have made sure that there's operational plans in place, as there were this summer when major events occur. And one of the saddest memories of that day was the fact that 75% of the police officers asked to defend this Capitol were in plain clothes. 75%. In many cases, they had less protective gear on than the invaders of the Capitol. That has changed. No more equipment that's going to be locked on a bus that they can't access. Senator Leahy's leadership with appropriations, Senator Shelby's leadership, we've been able to obtain more funding to get them the equipment that they need. All of those things are important. But as Senator Schumer noted, the other piece of this is our democracy itself. And that means getting to the bottom of what happened. Something is happening right now with the House Select Committee that is working to get the facts. And we would have loved to have an independent commission like the 9/11 Commission to do that, but they are doing that work over in the House. Yesterday, we heard from Attorney General Garland, who pledged to look at this at every level and to go where the facts will lead. Those were his words. Accountability at every level for what happened here is key. And it is the largest investigation we've seen in the history of America. Over 700 people that have been charged. That is a big piece of this work as well, accountability. And as Senator Schumer noted, this is also about carrying on the torch of our democracy. The voting rights legislation that we are working on right now couldn't be more important, because what was not accomplished with bear spray and bayonets has now been passed on to others to pass bills, as we've seen in Wisconsin, where a bill actually passed that would have allowed for only one ballot drop-off box in the entire city of Milwaukee. That one was vetoed by Governor Evers. But others have passed in states like Georgia, in states like Texas, and across this country, a concerted effort to undermine our democracy. So it is on us, when we take an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States, no matter what party we're in, to hold our democracy dear. It is a precious, precious thing, and it is very fragile, and it is in our hands to protect, just as our police officers protected it on January 6th. When you've got 9,600 threats against members of Congress, double what it has ever been in the past, that's not a small thing. That is January 6th continued. When you have election officials that have to leave their posts because, in the words of the election official from the city of Philadelphia, that his own family was threatened, their names, their addresses, their house put out on the internet. Katie Hobbs, Secretary of State in Arizona, receiving a voicemail saying, "I'm a hunter, and I think you should be hunted." People in rural areas that are elected officials that cannot have the kind of security that people may have in this building. That's January 6th continued, and we cannot forget our duty going forward. I will end with that image that I will always cherish, and the hope that democracy will prevail at 3:30 in the morning when Senator Blunt and I and Vice President Pence took that long walk over to the House with the two young women with the mahogany box filled with the last of the electoral ballots up through Wyoming. There was broken glass on all sides. There was spray paint on statues. It was the same walk we had taken in the morning, which had been so joyful, the celebration of our democracy, so ceremonial. And there we were, the last ones left, taking that walk into the House chambers where we finished our job. So when I look back at that day, that is the lasting image, that in the end, democracy prevailed, that in 2 weeks later, there we were under that beautiful blue sky with leaders of both parties on that inaugural stage saying that, yes, our democracy stood tall it brushed itself off, and we move forward as one nation under God with liberty and justice for all, as we always do. And that is a spirit with which we must go forward in the coming weeks as we debate the importance of keeping that democracy strong